So to conclude 5.2 then, I just wanted to work through a couple exercises here to give you the hang of this. So we're going to look here first of all at exercise set 1. And here I've reproduced 4 of the problems from that, all non-starred problems. And the task in this first set of exercises is simply to identify the main operator. And I'm hoping that this is a fairly intuitive task for you. But I do want to say that if it's not, if you struggle identifying the main operator, if you find yourself identifying the wrong operator as the main operator, really we should probably get together in my office hours or something like this because being able to identify the main operator is not just essential for Chapter 5, but it also is essential skill for Chapter 6 and 7, really for the rest of the course. So make sure you're getting the hang of this. But let's start with number 2 here. What we have, of course, is G.P statement. We have a stuff here in the parentheses, horseshoe, tilde this stuff, okay? So I'm hoping that the order of operations here is pretty clear. In other words, this is the main operator, the horseshoe. And what we would do is we come up with a value for P, plug it into the tilde, then that would plug into the dot along with the G, right, if you're following that order of operations. Then the dot would plug into the horseshoe from the left. Here on the right-hand side, we have the H feeding into the wedge and the tilde feeding into the wedge, which of course means the W is feeding into the tilde. And then once we get the wedge value determined, that feeds into the tilde, which itself then feeds into the horseshoe. So I'm hoping you're following those arrows, right? But the key here to this is just to understand the main operator is the horseshoe and understand how all these other little pieces build up and then eventually feed into that main operator, right, as the last thing you would think about. So the main operator there is the horseshoe. Now in number 3 here, I'm just going to warn you that if people struggle with identifying the main operator or ever make a mistake in this area, it usually comes with a problem like number 3. Because what we see here is this tilde is sort of lurking here off to the far left, and it is actually the main operator. The tilde is the main operator because these square brackets encapsulate the whole of the rest of it. And so this dot would feed into the tilde. The tilde would be the last thing we do. How do we get the dot value? Well, of course, we would get the P and plug it in there. We would get the triple bar and plug it in from the right-hand side. So you take the last thing on the left, plug it into the dot, last thing on the right, plug it into the dot, and then that dot, because of the square brackets, feeds into the tilde itself, and the tilde is the main operator of that particular statement. Here in number 8, right? Notice the square brackets. The square brackets essentially group this whole thing together. So what we're looking at is this, triple bar, this, and that tells us then that it's the triple bar that's the main operator. And in terms of the order of operations, the last thing you do on the right, the tilde here, would feed into it from the right. And then over here, the last thing you would do would be the wedge feeding into it from the left. Finally, in number 9, I think we could say Hurley's doing all he can to try and trick you. We've got these square brackets here. Notice where those are and how they group the material. So all of that dot E, or E dot all of that, in other words. So it's actually the dot. That's the main operator, and the E feeds into it, and the triple bar feeds into it from the right. But the dot is the main operator way over here to the left. Sometimes it's in the middle, as we saw in the first example, but it can be anywhere, really have any location here in this problem. Okay. So that's determining the main operator. Again, practice the other ones. Make sure you're getting the hang of this. But from that, then, we have a more important section, actually, in exercise set 2 here from 5.2. And I say that because the very first section of exercises on the next exam will look very much like what you see here in this. So what we have here is we have a variety of statements expressed in English, and we're going to work on number 2. Okay. Number 2, and we're asked to translate it into propositional logic and then use our knowledge of the truth of the statements, of the truth value of the statements that are in that overall statement to determine if the statement is true or false. So in other words, number 2 there says, Nixon resigned the presidency. So we're going to get N for Nixon resigned the presidency. And so we have a dot. Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address, L. All right? So what I have just done here is just what we did in section 5.1. Take the statement in English, translate it into the symbols of propositional logic. Nixon resigned the presidency, that's our short affirmative statement, and Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address, that's another short affirmative statement. Now, a lot of people can handle that because you've done that in 5.1, but here, this is very important, and it does confuse people from time to time. So what you need to do next is ask yourself, what does N stand for? N stands for Nixon resigned the presidency. And then you ask yourself, oh, did Nixon resign the presidency? Why, yes, he did. So that is a true statement. Then you ask yourself, what does L stand for? L stands for Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address. Did Lincoln write the Gettysburg Address? Yes, he did. And so that is also a true statement. And so, in the end now, we're simply going to use the order of operations that I've been talking about to determine if this statement as a whole is true or false. So what we find here is true, true, and we know from the truth tables for the logical operator involved here, the dot, that would be a true statement. And we're not just going to say it's a true statement. We're also going to circle it. We're also going to identify that value here as the main operator. This is very important because if you don't identify the main operator, all we have are a bunch of trues and falses here. But we need to know where the answer, so to speak, is, what the truth value for this overall statement is. Okay. So the next one says that France bombed Pearl Harbor or Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. This is number 3. France bombed Pearl Harbor, F, or Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. And so once again, once we've translated it, we need to use our knowledge of these historical claims to fill in the gaps here. So France bombed Pearl Harbor? No, they didn't. Lincoln crossed the Atlantic? Why, yes, he did. False, wedge, true. Well, actually, anytime you have true feeding into the wedge is true. So that's a true statement. And we circle it underneath the main operator. Number 5. We're going to skip the starred problem, so we'll go to number 5. Edison invented the telephone, or Custer was killed by the Indians, it says. So, did Edison invent the telephone? He did not. Was Custer killed by American Indians? He was. Oops, wrong color. False, wedge, true, just like we saw, is true again. Do one more here. Alexander the Great, number 6 says, Alexander the Great civilized America if Napoleon ruled France. A little bit tricky. We have a horseshoe because it says if. What comes here on the left side of the horseshoe would be the antecedent, the part that comes after the word if. So N here stands for Napoleon ruled France. That comes after the word if. A stands for Alexander the Great civilized America. So we get the translation. Now we ask ourselves, did Napoleon rule France? Yes. Did Alexander the Great civilize America? Well, nobody's ever civilized America, so false. Just kidding. So false. False there. True, horseshoe, false? False. Based on the truth tables for the logical operator horseshoe here. So we get false there. Now, let's just throw in a little twist here. Let's say that instead of this sentence saying, Alexander the Great civilized America if Napoleon ruled France, let's say it said, if Napoleon did not rule France. The statement would be, Alexander the Great civilized America if Napoleon didn't rule France. Throw a tilde into the mix. Well, N, again, stands for Napoleon did rule France. Did Napoleon do that? Yes, he did. The tilde, though, would make that false, and it's actually the tilde that's feeding in to the horseshoe. Did Alexander the Great civilize America? No, Alexander the Great didn't. Now what we'd be looking at, though, this is critical, we're not looking at true horseshoe false here. We're looking at false horseshoe false. And when we have false horseshoe false, we get a true statement. A true statement there. So it's critical that you understand that you're going to come up with the truth value for the individual affirmative proposition. Anytime you have a tilde there, then that will flip it to whatever the opposite value is, as we know. Okay, so you want to practice all of those from the second set of exercises because they're going to get you prepared for the exam, that first set of exercises there. I do want to say, in case anybody's worried about this, right, because some of this stuff, it's like, well, how do we know any of this stuff is true? And what we can remember here is that I will tell you now, so we're not really remembering it, but I'm going to tell you now, excuse me, that the claims you'll have to know the truth values of here will be stuff that corporations spend large sums of money to make sure that you know the truth value of. So, for example, did you know that Coca-Cola was not a candy bar? I bet you did, because the Coca-Cola Corporation spends a lot of money to make sure you do know that it's a soda pop. Did you know that Butterfinger, right, is not a soda pop but a candy bar, and so on. So I think it'll be very easy for you to determine the truth values of these individual propositions, but I will let you know that if you don't know any of those, you could certainly ask me. I will be there at the exam. Just ask me, I'm looking at this claim. Is it true or false? I'm not familiar with this. And I will tell you. Okay, so having said that, one other thing here is when it gets to exercise set 3, and then really you can look at the instructions for exercise set 4 from 5.2, there's really no difference from what we've been doing here, except that you don't have to do translations, and you were simply told in the instructions that, for example, anytime you see the letter N, make it true. Anytime you see the letter L, make it true, or whatever the instructions say. So you don't have to, query your knowledge of the truth of these individual claims. Just go based on the instructions in that exercise to know what letters to plug in here, and then you're going to work out the truth value for the whole statement in the same way we've just been doing.